Right, guys. I'd like to chat a little bit, if I may, on South Bank's Paul Venis. Um, I imagine, to be honest, Paul Venis has kind of came into fruition in this year, 2020. I first heard of him 2010. I worked in a place called Ward Recycling in South Bank, and Paul must have been in his early 20s then, and I'd go in after the weekend, and a lot of the lads there were from like Grangetown, Eston, South Bank, and I just overhear these stories of this kid Venner, and what he'd been up to, what he'd been fighting, what drugs he'd been taking. MCAT, I think, was the usual thing that always got spoken about. And he's one story basically I remember clearly even about Paul was him getting put in St. Luke's. I think it's called Rosebery Park now. So for anyone who's not from Middlesbrough, not familiar, it's the it's the mental hospital. And Paul, he was obviously living a life where the only things inevitable, if he hadn't woke up, would have been death or a life sentence. So, long story short, Paul, very predictably ended up in prison with a lengthy custodial sentence. His house was shot up with well, it wasn't a spud gun. So yeah, he was down a dark path, stuck in a life of chaos, mayhem, destruction, just hell bent basically, and went to prison. And I think that's what kind of made Paul change his ways. He read a book and became extremely close friends with a guy called Shane Taylor from Middlesbrough, who was very similar to Paul. He was how can I put it? He was slightly off the ball, to put it mildly, and he found God. Shane, he's a lovely guy, very genuine. You can see through him like glass for what he is. I love Shane to bits. But I think Paul reached out to him because he'd seen Shane almost fighting in a street in South Bank, and they nearly came to blows. I think Shane pulled a knife on him and said, "If you ever move, I'm going to kill you." And Paul was like, obviously, Paul Venis is quite a big guy. He can have a fight, and I think Paul actually looked back and thought, he probably would kill me. Him, like, he's So Paul was in prison, and I think it was that he come across a book of this guy Shane, this nutter who we'd seen years ago, and demonic look on Shane's face had gone. So Paul, I think he reached out to Shane, and Shane went to visit him. If anyone's seen Shane Taylor on Sean Atwood's podcast, then obviously you know what kind of life he had. And so basically when Paul met Shane, he realised that this kind of guy who was just out to just cause carnage had gone, and it was replaced by just warmth and love. And that was the start of Paul Venis finding Jesus, if you like. Paul come out of prison a changed man. I think it must have been around the time, kind of 26, 27, which was, because in my opinion, Paul Venis's life was the mirror image of Lee Duffy's. Not only does he look like him, they can fight, come from the same area, but you know, Paul was into. He was, yeah. I can't put into words. You know, he was beyond crazy, and he basically turned his life around from that day forward, and found God and started doing, you know, the good things. And that's Paul's side basically. But this year, you know, I know people who have spent thousands of pounds going to drama school, and it hasn't really given them the springboard that you would expect. Now, I think it's written in the stars that Paul Venis looks so much like Lee. He's from South Bank. He had the lifestyle like Lee, God rest him. And all of a sudden he got a call basically saying, is this Paul Venis? Do you want to play the part of Lee Duffy? And Paul was like, yeah, right, or put it down. And then the people from Newcastle were like, no, seriously, this is someone. Do you want to play the part of Lee Duffy? And obviously the rest is history, and the film's going to start next year. Probably would have started this year, albeit God had different plans with COVID-19, as my film, the Paul Sykes film, was due to start in September this year. You know, but can't be helped. Nature's the world's a strange place at the minute. So basically, Paul, I don't know why he's still here. I don't know why his missus has stood by him, but she has. And he's become. I love his company. I've got quite close to him last couple of months, and my wife's a really good judge of character. I'm thick as shit. I just see the goodness in people, where my wife's kind of switched on, and she's like, you know what? He's lying, he's trying to, you know, where Paul, you know, it's quite sad actually, because I was talking to Paul's mum yesterday, lovely woman, Senga, and Paul, he'll always this kind of big character and scary looking and all this kind of stuff. He's almost like this little boy inside, and and basically he has this kind of lack of self-esteem, where I don't think he just doesn't believe. It's almost like when things are going good in life, someone's going to shit on him or pull the rug under his feet. So it's not the case, and you know, I'm really I'm talking to Paul, and I said, listen, you don't realise what the opportunities are in front of you. Now, I'm not I'm not saying this role as Lee Duffy is going to change his life and he's going to become a millionaire, because he's certainly not. You know, I imagine he's probably only going to have to spend 5 or 6 days on set. You know, but what he has done is give him, you know, it's like Paul Sykes with me. Basically, I read the book, I watched a documentary, and I walked into the story, and I met all the characters, and now I've got a career doing so many different things. And because he looks like Lee Duffy, because he's from South Bank, because he's been a fighter in his life, this is almost give him, like, he met Lee actually as a kid. His mother was telling me yesterday, said he's seen him in a pram, and Lee used to wear a flying jacket, and Lee went up to Zenga and went, oh, look at him there, and Paul was there with his big head and his hair combed back and his flying jacket on, and Lee went up, baby Paul must have been 2 or 3 or whatever, and he's like, fucking hell, he's going to be another Lee Duffy, him, Zenga. And she's like, it's fucking not. And yeah, it's funny, it's written in the stars, I think. You know, I know there was 150 people at the Irish Centre before Christmas. Although all them weren't going for the part of Lee Duffy, I imagine literally dozens of them were. And I know a lot of people in Middlesbrough have had the say because it's caused mixed emotions. I've had the same with, I've had people saying to me, you know, listen, I'd rather you not do that book. And I've come away and for days I'm not going to do it. And then someone said to me, well, if you don't do it, someone else is going to do it. And that's very much the same with Paul Venis. If he doesn't take this part of Lee Duffy, there's only going to be a Cockney, there's going to be a Brummie, there's going to be a Scouser, a Geordie putting on a Teesside accent. And that's, you know, it's huge. It's absolutely huge. And my plan for Paul is, you know, now we've got very familiar with each other, is he's going to be in my third documentary, which is Lee Duffy, Too Far Too Soon, and that's going to be out November the 27th. It's good. It's made by Paul Suggett, Dan Walker's Fat Cat Productions. Extremely professional. I absolutely love them guys. I'm looking forward to working with them in the future. Things like the Roy Shaw documentary. What else? We're even going to do something on possibly Alex Reid. Even Paul Venis. You know, Paul has that, and a lot of people look at Paul and think, yeah, he can fight. He was a world champion. He was a British champion. He was a European champion. He's this rough lad. But the thing with Paul was, which I think the biggest thing is about Paul Venis is he was homeless. He was a drug addict. He was ravaged. He had nothing. You know, even the people who liked him used to see him and they'd be like, oh shit, there's Venis there. And, you know, I spoke to a taxi driver the other week and they said, you know, as low as Paul ever got, he always got in my car with manners and humanity, and he has a lot of decency about him. And I'm not going to lie, he's been a bad guy, but I imagine the bad things he's done, you know, because he was bullied. He was a bully's dream. He was the little fat kid, ginger hair from South Bank, wall-eyed, and yeah, he got some horrific good items as a kid. And basically, our documentary is, you know, I'm biased, but I think it's absolutely outstanding. I've only seen about 40 minutes of it, and it's going to be for 1 hour, 40 minutes. And Paul Suggett, it's made by 4K, which is literally your Netflix level, your sound quality, your television standard, basically. You know, and Fat Cat, I just, you know, they've done outstanding. But certainly with Paul Venis, you know, you've seen the books on the Steve Richards books, which he basically did the blueprint for Lee Duffy. He come along and he did the books almost 20 years ago. I've done the books. So, you know, there's been the Middlesbrough side, there's been the Newcastle side, where now, you know, before all that, yeah, there was Teesside, he was Borough, he was Middlesbrough, but first and foremost, Lee Duffy was a South Bank lad, and he was really patriotic and proud of his roots. One of his favourite sayings was, yeah, South Bank, sweet as a nut. You know, so this is, you know, I know there's going to be critics out there saying, well, hang on a minute, Paul Venis was just nearly 6 when Lee Duffy died. Listen, we're not trying to say Paul knew Lee, but Paul's kind of, you know, if you like, he's a spokesman for the South Bank community for this book. And I'm not going to name names, but they've kind of, you know, I've worked on this for nearly 3 years now. As far as I'm concerned, I've done the whole of the moon, the blood moon. I said, you know, unless there was someone like a sibling or a really, really close friend, then I'm done, you know. Listen, I'd write Neil Booth's book for free. He's never going to do it, unless he loses everything and becomes on drugs and begs me to do it, which I always wind Neil up. But I love him dearly. And yeah, you know, so really it's going to be done. But from me. But Paul, this is the South Bank voice, if you like, and yeah, he grew up in South Bank when Paul was a little kid. And when he was like 7, 8, 9, they'd go on the bikes and they'd go and stare at his grave in the 90s. And people grew up in South Bank like people do in Inverness with the Loch Ness Monster, or Nottingham Robin Hood. There's this kind of attached to mythical folklore stories. And South Bank, yeah, this has basically been the voice of the South Bank community for the first time, and Paul's gonna put it out. So yeah, I think you're gonna get to know Paul. Listen, we all know what he was: drug addict, fighter, antisocial, bad behaviour. Some would say not a very nice person, and he was at his low. He was vulnerable. Some people he used to fight with when he was in his prime, he would wipe the floor with, and he got that low. I mean, he left school when he was 16 stone, and I think when he was a drug addict, he said to me, he got something like 14 stone, and his vulnerability kind of showed, and I think that's what would have happened to Lee, because in the end of his life, obviously he was a crack cocaine addict. He'd been shot more than once, petrels. There was people out, and the guy, the kid, really, because the kid was living on his nerves. But for some reason, and only he knows upstairs, Paul Venis is still here. So the next couple of months, listen, everything. I mean, Paul's now he's opened his own business, but he's with his car business, D&P, I think it's called D&P Valeton. But Paul, I've encouraged him. He's basically sitting on a gold mine. There's not many truly world-class athletes from Middlesbrough. Let me think. I mean, Cornelius Carr fought for a world title. Jonathan Woodgate, I suppose, was world class, but he was injured. But when you think of how many real world class athletes Middlesbrough Teesside have produced, it's very, very hard. And although K1's not a massive household sport, Paul was at the top of, it was the pinnacle of his field. And I've only realised really what a legend he was, because I've Googled the forums last couple of weeks, and people have been like, oh, there's a kid from South Bank literally knocking everyone out. So you think, what could he have done? He was unbeaten. I think it was only ever Gary Fairby who ever went the distance with him. But imagine if Paul had kind of really avoided drugs and knuckled down and not made the mistakes, because really his life until he turned and found God was the mirror image of Lee Duffy's, and he was only gonna end up pushing up daisies in Eston Cemetery and being one of them graves that the young kids go and say, oh yeah, there's Paul Venis there, used to be an hard case, where now he's got the opportunity to be in films, which is going to be in the Sayers film next year. He's going to be in my documentary with Fat Cat Productions this month. He's got his book, A Very South Bank Story. And when I say it's a very South Bank story, it's because it's Paul from South Bank. It's predominantly about 60-70% about Lee Duffy. And Paul Truscott, the Commonwealth champion, is doing the forward. Again, he was very young when Lee died, but he was Paul's best friend. So the book is a very, very South Bank story, and it's something that I googled it the other week, 2011, and there was 6,500 people live there. I've googled to how big it is. 30 years ago, you didn't have to even go out to South Bank because there was a market. It had its own football ground. It had nightclubs. It was a right, what's the word? Riverton little high street. It was yeah, it was. You got everything on your doorstep, and Paul said to me, funny enough, he said the other week, he said, you know something, whatever happens in the future, whether I play this part and it flops or I become the next Tom Hardy, he said, I'll never leave South Bank. He said, so obviously the guy has got South Bank in his blood. And yeah, this book, you know, a few tales are outside South Bank just because they're so outrageous and couldn't be left out. But you know, most of them are. It's a very South Bank story. And then, so what? You've got Paul's first book. He's going to release a second book, an autobiography, a couple of months after the film, which is obviously, touch wood, COVID-19. That's next month. And then he's on the Jimmy O show this month. He's on Sean Atwood's this month, and I actually got a phone call a couple of weeks back. I mean, I've tried for certain people in the past, and I've never, you know, I've had people in like Naughty Boy Schools in Thornaby and Peterlee, but I actually got a call from someone quite high up in Home House Prison saying, Jamie, I watched you and Paul Venis on YouTube. I remember Paul being in an ear, and I'd like him to come in and give his testament. And then I spoke to him the other day, and he said, you know, look, all these kids, the probation officers, policemen, the people come in and talk to them, and they're like, yeah, he's that. Where someone like Paul Venis who's come in, who's been homeless, who's been a crack addict, who's been a drug addict, who's been a robber, a dishonest, every kind of thing that you shouldn't be, Paul Venis has been. And look what he is now. You know, I mean, his parents, Paul and Zenga, I spoke to Zenga yesterday, and I'm with Paul Senior on Friday. And you've just done you know, even though Paul did what he did, yeah, he's huge credit to you, because there's a saying, you know, don't never regret anything if someone can learn from it. And you know, Paul's here now. He was 35 the other week, and he's lived through it all, and he could sit with people in the classroom and blow them away, because there was nobody as low as Paul Venis at one point. You know, the first time I ever seen Paul Venis was May 2005. I was working as part of the security for what was it again? It was a documentary, actually. It was Rent-A-Cop, Francis Jones doing a documentary, and I'd seen him from the papers and all that. And sorry, Paul, if you're watching, but the first thing I thought about him is he was this big lad, very fit, a lot athletic than he is now, because obviously he's packed the muscle on. This was obviously when he was fighting, and my first thought of him was, what an awful haircut. He was kind of bald round the side and like combed over. It was just like, I just thought he was just a big rough looking lad with a hideous haircut. And yeah, and funny enough, it was when about 3.5 years ago, when I released my first book, Paul Sykes. That's been signed to be a film now by Western Edge Pictures. I got a message off one of Paul's friends, a really funny guy who I've come to quite like, Mark Fitzgerald. And he said, this was about 3.5 years ago. I mean, I've only known Paul January, and I got good energy off him straight away. You know, because sometimes you've got to think, yeah, you might be an interesting story, but will less shit on you, you know. The last thing I could do with really is having a Paul Venis who's not very, you know, I'd have to set Bob and Dave on him, or I'd have to set my wife on him or something like that. But anyway, Mark Fitzgerald messaged me, and he said, I tell you what, Jamie, you should write a book on a lad from Middlesbrough called Paul Venis. And I was like, at the time I was into the Paul Sykes, the Roy Shaw. I was chasing the big names, if you like. Do you know what I mean? I was thinking like, yeah, you know, it might be an interesting story, but no one's really heard of him. And funny enough, I seen Paul as well. I seen him in York a couple of years back, and when I was talking to Paul, he went, "Oh yeah, I was in York." I remember looking at him thinking, "You're from Middlesbrough, you." But you know what? I think, and Mark Fitzgerald said it's fate. He said, you know, there's a saying in life which is, "What's for you, what won't go by." Paul's very Christian. I start my day on my knees talking to God. I got that on because for anything I ever go and do something stupid, I look at that and to remind me, you know, I'm not a Christian, even though I do lots of stupid things. And I finished the day talking to God and sleeping with rosary beads in my hand. And Paul's very spiritual. But for what, you know, listen, you all know what, there's people out there who know Paul Venis far better than me. And there might be people saying he's a scumbag. You know, Shane Taylor's had it, where he's done some despicable acts and stabbed people and done all it, and he's went and tried to speak to his victim, and they've said they wouldn't accept his apology, and you know, and he's just had to accept that. Listen, I've just finished Gary Fairby's book, the Duke of Windy Nook, and Gary done something really bad and asked for someone's forgiveness, went to prison, and he wouldn't, and that's everyone's. You know, I'm just going to have to actually the battery's going to die. That's everyone's. It's up to them, isn't it? But I think the future's big for Paul. You know, whatever he's gonna. I just think he's a nice kid. He's a local lad from Middlesbrough, and I'd like everyone to get behind him. And it's a pleasure working with him. He struggles daily. You know, some people might think, oh, the big tough guy. In my opinion, he's a little boy in this big bruiser's body. But I'm going to do my best to really push him in the next couple of years and see where he ends up, because you know I've got my limits where I've got big things. I've got 2 years work lined up, and I said to Paul, with or without you, I'm doing it, but I want Paul to come on the journey. I've got great love for him. So yeah, Paul Venis, he's a good guy, and you're going to get to hear a lot more in this story. Not only was he a world champion, all this kind of stuff, he's added a hell of a life as well. But he had good parents, and he's the first one to say, you know what, all my mistakes were by me. I hold my hands up, and if there's any young kids out there who can learn from Paul Venis, if it can be just one, then Paul's job is done. So keep following the page, guys. War Cry Publishing. This is a YouTube channel, and thank you so much for your interest and support. God bless.